Today's daf is daf Ayin Zayin. We are going to be beginning a brand new perek Azerik, a very yeshedistic perek that they learn in the yeshivas, a lot of lumdis. We're going to be learning always Kedarkenu, Pshat, which includes Gemara Rashi, and Eretz Hashem Naaseh V'Nasdech daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, starting by the new perek Azerik. The Mishnah now starts off with the din of Hazer get l'ishta if somebody throws a get to his wife. He would say beisa, he would say chatzera, and she is either in her house or in her chatzar, in her courtyard. So the halach is harizei migresha, she is divorced, and the chiddush is even if the get is not placed in her hand, but it's just placed either in beisa or chatzera, so she's migreshes. If he throws it to her in his house or in his chatzar, even if they're in the same bed, Allah is any migresha, she is not divorced because it was thrown in his domain. However, if she is in his house and it was thrown either in her chest, in her lap, or in her basket, Allah is harizu migresha, she is divorced. From where do we know that a husband can throw a get to his wife either in the house or in a courtyard and the divorce takes effect? Tana Rabbanan, we learned that the Torah says in regards to a divorce, v'nasam biyada, and you give it in her hand. From here, the Brisa says, "Ein li yada." From here, I know that if you give the get in her hand, she is divorced. However, gaga chatzera ve'kar fifa. What if you throw it either in the roof or in a courtyard or an enclosure? Minayin, where do we know that she is divorced? Amalemar. Therefore, the Torah says v'nasan and gives it, which means mikol mokem, indicating that she is divorced in any case, regardless of the manner in which she gives the divorce. We learned as well, the Brisa says, in regards to a thief, a ganev, the Torah says, Yodoi, if the theft is found in his hands, from here I know that if the Geneva is found in his hand, then he is chayiv. However, what if the Geneva is found either in the roof or the courtyard or the enclosure? In other words, the item reached the domain and he secured it with the intent to steal. So we don't know that he's also chayav tamalemer. That's why the pasuk says he matzi timasi. If the geneva is found, which means mikol mokem in any case, and I need, it's necessary to teach me the halacha, side the geneva and side the get, to teach me the chiddush that these places are koina. Why? The Yishrin get if the Torah would only tell me about get mishum debal karcha megorshi, because a husband can divorce his wife against her will. The divorce is effective regardless of the husband places. So I would think that dafke there, all these places work. However, ganev, but by the case of the ganev, which the less of al korchi, you cannot make a ganev chayiv to force him if he performs something against his will. So emelei, I would say that in these places it does not work. Therefore, the Torah has to teach me both places. Now, b'yashmin and ganev, if the Torah would only tell me about ganev, I would say mishum de kanse rachmana, because the Torah penalized the ganev, which a ganev has to be careful. So therefore, we see that the Torah is very strict about Geneva. Similarly, the Torah also would make the person responsible, even if the item was not actually in his hand. I will get, but in regards to a get, I would say that no, the divorce is not effective unless it goes in his hands. Therefore, the Torah is to teach me in both cases. Now, it was taught in the Mishnah that if the husband threw the get into his wife's courtyard, so she is divorced. So the Gemara says, how can she own a courtyard? Chatzeda. We know there's a chatzera, a courtyard. We know mashakonse isha kana baila. There's a din that a woman, whatever a woman acquired, is acquired by her husband. Which the chayra, if the husband has the right to, let's say, nechsimiloig, or the rights to all the profits generated by his wife's property, so the chayra, the courtyard belongs to him during the duration of the marriage. So how could b'chlal a chatzera be kaina if it belongs to the husband? So Rabbi Elazar says, the Mishnah is talking about the case of law. He wrote to her, I have no legal involvement in your properties. In other words, he relinquishes any ownership rights to her property. So the Gemara says, so what? Even if he writes it to her, my have it, what's the big deal? Or it should not work. My have it, does it really work? If a person tells his friend, they're shutfin, they're partners, and he tells his friend, I have no rights and claims against this field. I have no involvement with it. Or my hand is removed from it. In all these cases, he didn't say anything. Why? Because these expressions are not considered to be a expression that withdraws his rights to the field. So even if he says, the fact is that the husband owns it, so he does. These words do not relinquish his ownership. So the question is, kol mashikona isha kona baila. So Amar Rabbi Yana, in case of law, Vaidarusa, that he wrote to her while they're still engaged, Rav Kana. And like Rav Kana says, Rav Kana nachla, if a person gets inheritance that comes from not from the father, from a different place, so the din is, a person can make a condition that he's not going to inherit it, which teaches us that the property has not yet, that as long as the property did not enter his possession, he could withdraw his rights to it. And that's what he did. While they're in Arusa, he says that I do not have anything to do with your property. Like Rabbi says, if a person says, I do not want to have the Takanas Chachamim, we listen to him. So the Gemara says, what does he mean by saying in such a case? What did Rabbi refer to that in such a similar case? A woman could tell her husband that the aim is in it, I don't want to be sustained by you, and I will not work for you. In other words, even though Chacham instituted on her behalf that she would be sustained in exchange for her work, she has the choice to be moichel rights if she prepares to retain her earnings. Rav added that any similar case with the Chacham made a takana to benefit one party, so this party could tell the other party, I do not want to have the takana Chacham. Rabbi said that you can resolve the question about the ability for a wife to acquire a divorce in the courtyard. Rabbi says, is to say that her hand is not acquired by her husband. In other words, despite the fact that he owns her hand, you can still give the get to her hand and she's divorced. Rather, you have to say that the get and her hand, her complete ownership over her hand, enter possession simultaneously. Since the get releases her from her obligations to her husband, at that moment she acquires full rights too. So Hachanami here too in our case, you have to say that her get and her courtyard enter possession simultaneously, as her husband's rights to her the property are terminated at the time of the divorce. Ravina says to Ravashi, Rava Yad Isha Kashili, was it difficult for Rava to understand the halacha that one can effect divorce by placing a get in the hand of a woman? Why is this difficult? Granted that her earnings belong to her husband, Yoda Gufa Mikanya, does her hand itself belong to him? Therefore, since a woman owns her hand, she's divorced once she receives the get in her hand. It's not necessary to apply the principle that it comes boing kechad. So therefore, there's no raya that the get and her chotzer come together. So Ravashi says to him, Rava Yada Eved Kukashli. It was shver to Rava. It was difficult for Rava to understand the halacha that one can affect a shtar shifra by a get. Why? Because the manda Omar b'shtar, according to the one who says that a slave can be free with a shtar shifra by receiving the bill himself, how is this effective? Yad Eved ki Yad Rabbi. We know the hand of a slave is like the hand of the master, and the master owns the slave's body. Therefore, when the master gives the get shifra, it's as though he gave it to himself, and the bill is never considered to have reached the slave's domain. Rather, you have to say the get and the yad come together. I think about a story. There was a shchimena who wrote a get divorce to divorce his wife towards the evening of the coming of the Shabbos. And he did not manage to give it to her. The next day, it was so difficult to give it to him. Also, the command that Rabbi came from Rav Amalei says, Zil Amalei, tell him that they should transfer to her ownership of that place where the get divorcing is resting. And she should go and close the door and open it and make a chazaka for herself. The Tanakh we learned in the Mishnah no, God, part of scholarship, if one locked, fenced, or breached any amount, this is a chazaka. Rav Elish said to Rav, how will help her to acquire the place? Whatever the woman acquired is acquired by her husband. So the Gemara says, Rav was embarrassed that he didn't pass in correct. So if you go in Milsa Derusa at the end, it was revealed that she was a Yarusa. Rav says, in other words, I pass in correct. And even they said with regard to a married woman, they say this with regards to a Yarusa. Rav says, there's no difference. You have to say that her divorce and her courtyard enter her position simultaneously. The Gemara asks, didn't Rav already say this halacha that they get and her bani ke'echad? When Rav says that he was saying in regards to this was connection with this maisa. It was taught in the Mishnah that if the husband throws the get, he would say beisa, and she is in her house. and she's divorced. Amar Ula says, she has to be standing next to her house and next to her courtyard, and only then will her house and her courtyard acquired. Even if she's in Teferi and the Chatzar is in Tziperi, or he B'Tziperi, Tziperi, Allah is Mugay Eshes, she is Mugay Eshes. Where it says, it says clearly she's in her house and she's in her courtyard. Where it says, this is what it means to say, that she's considered to be like the one who was in her house. And she's considered to be like the one in her courtyard. Since it is the courtyard that is secure with her knowledge, she is divorced. So where it says, when we say this is what the argument, that Ula holds that the Chatzar is included in the areas that she can attain ownership as an extension of her hand. So it's the same malach as her hand. Just as her hand is close to her, so to the Chatzar must be close to her in order to be acquired the get. Mar Summer and the Rabbi will hold that the courtyard is included in the area where she can attain ownership as an extension of shlichus, and therefore, like a shtiliach, her Chatzar can acquire the divorce for her when she is far away. So the Gemara says, no. Everyone says that Chatzar is included in her hand. So Ula will hold that has to be like her hand, just as her actual hand is next to her, so to the Chatzar has to be next to her. The Idach and Rabbi S holds that if you're learning it out from her hand, it's just like a person's hand is attached to her, so to her courtyard has to be attached to her. Rather, her hand means just as her hand is secured with the knowledge of Chatzar, so too a courtyard that is consciously secured by her hand. This comes to exclude her courtyard that is not consciously secured by her hand. In other words, that she has no control over, which she cannot acquire a divorce since it's not similar to her hand. I think when I got there was a Maisa with a man who threw a get to his wife while she was standing in a court of a Kameh B'Chatzar, and so what happened? Ozal Gittin Daf B'Pisla. The get went and fell on a board of wood. If the board was 4 amas by 4 amas, then plag then it makes a separate domain on its own. It's not included in the Chatzar within which she was standing, and she is not divorced. And if the board was not large enough, then then it's part of the one domain. So Mara says, 1 second. What are we dealing with here? If it's her Chatzar, even if the board was 4 amas, who cares that it fell into her Chatzar? Rather, it's his Chatzar. Even if it's not 4 amas, who cares? Since none of it belongs to her, why would it be an effective divorce? So the Mara answers, it's not necessary in a case where the Oishla Makim, where he lent her a place. In other words, he lent the courtyard as a means to acquire the get. The Chad Makim, Moshe, people lend one place, but today Makim is the Moshe Inshe, people do not lend 2 places. The Gemara says, and we said this, Allah, that only in a case where the place onto which the get fell was not 10 Tvachim high. But if it was higher than 10 Tvachim, even if it was not Abrahamis, it's still not considered, it's considered a separate domain. And they said this Allah only in the case where the place onto which the get fell does not have a shame levai, like a unique name. But it has a unique name. Even if it's not 10 Tvachim, even if it's not Abrahamis, it's still considered to be a separate rishus and would therefore not be an effective domain.